Did Meghan Markle really marry Trevor Engelson just to get a green card? Imagine finding out that the person you loved, trusted, and built your life around was only using you as a stepping stone. Imagine believing in a fairy tale romance, only to discover that the story had been scripted by someone else all along. Trevor Engelson, a successful Hollywood producer with a career on the rise, thought he had found love, thought he had found a partner for life. But the shocking truth he would uncover years later has the potential to rewrite everything we thought we knew about Meghan Markle, long before she became a global household name. Trevor has gone on record saying, "She only needed me to secure her green card." He claims he has emails, lawyer notes, and private correspondence that reveal a calculated plan, a story so meticulously designed that it reads like a masterclass in manipulation. And yet, at the time, all he saw were smiles, charm, and the excitement of being in love. What would you do if you realized that the foundation of your marriage was built on something entirely false? That's the question that haunts Trevor Engelson to this day. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Their story begins like so many romances in Hollywood: whirlwind, glamorous, filled with red carpet appearances, glitzy dinners, and endless attention from fans and paparazzi alike. Trevor, a rising producer with an impressive track record, met Meghan at a time when both were chasing success, ambition, and perhaps adventure. From the outside, they seemed perfect together. Everyone around them, including close friends and family, saw the chemistry, the laughter, the kind of connection that makes people envious. But behind closed doors, something entirely different was brewing. The first hint of tension came subtly, almost imperceptibly. Perhaps it was in the way Meghan would sometimes avoid personal questions, or how she seemed more focused on her public image than the private moments that truly define a relationship. Maybe it was the little inconsistencies, the stories that didn't quite match, the tiny gaps between words and actions. Trevor, understandably, brushed these aside. Who doesn't see the occasional quirk in a partner? Who doesn't attribute slight oddities to nerves, stress, or simply being human? But as months went on, the pattern became undeniable. The warm, consistent attention he had once received began to fade. The late-night calls stopped. Texts went unanswered. And yet, on the surface, everything appeared normal. It's that exact contrast, public perfection, private coldness, that makes this story so shocking. And then there was the green card. For those unfamiliar, a green card is not just a document, it's a gateway. It represents permanent residency, freedom to live and work, and the ability to build a life in the United States. Trevor, in his naivety, trusted that the process would unfold naturally, that love and bureaucracy could coexist without manipulation. He had no idea that the timeline he was witnessing might be a carefully orchestrated sequence, a subtle dance designed to achieve a singular goal: permanent status for Meghan. Leaked documents, emails, and legal notes paint a picture that is almost too precise to ignore. According to Trevor, these documents suggest a deliberate plan. The correspondence shows patterns, timelines, and communications that, when pieced together, create a chilling narrative. It wasn't that Meghan was ambitious or that she had dreams. Those are normal human traits. It was that ambition intersected with manipulation, creating a perfect storm that left Trevor blindsided. And the realization didn't come all at once. It crept in, piece by piece, conversation by conversation, email by email, until the full weight of the truth hit him. The woman he thought he knew, loved, had, in his eyes, played him. And not just played him, used him, calculated him. Consider the psychology of it. Imagine investing emotionally, financially, and socially into a person, only to discover that your entire relationship had been a means to an end. Betrayal cuts deep. It's not just the ending, it's the deception that stings the most. Trevor, in interviews, has described that initial shock, that heart-dropping realization, that moment when you connect the dots and see the whole picture. He realized that what he thought was love might have been a tool. And the emotions don't stop at shock. They morph into anger, disbelief, grief, and eventually, a burning need to understand, to document, to explain. Trevor's perspective is particularly compelling because it predates Meghan's entry into the global spotlight as part of the royal family. This is a chapter of her life that the world rarely sees. The public narrative has been shaped by media coverage, Hollywood glamour, and later, royal protocols. But Trevor's story is intimate. It's personal. It's raw. And it challenges the narrative that love, partnership, and fairness were always at the center of Meghan's early adult life. In dissecting this story, it's important to also examine the contrast between public and private personas. The Meghan the world knew, a rising actress, intelligent, poised, and charismatic, is only one half of the equation. The Meghan Trevor describes, the Meghan behind closed doors, is portrayed as strategic, emotionally distant at times, and laser-focused on outcomes rather than relationships. The contrast is stark, and it raises uncomfortable questions about perception, truth, and the masks people wear in relationships. How much of what we see in public figures is curated, and how much is authentic? Trevor's revelations force us to confront this very question. What's perhaps most fascinating, and most disturbing, is how gradual the revelation was for Trevor. It wasn't an immediate realization. At first, he made excuses, rationalized inconsistencies, and hoped that love could bridge the gaps. But the more evidence he encountered, the harder it became to deny the pattern. Emails that should have been innocuous began to feel calculated. Lawyer documents that were intended to finalize standard procedures began to reveal strategic timing. Conversations that once felt intimate began to feel rehearsed. Each layer peeled back, each piece of evidence unearthed, added to a growing sense of betrayal. It's the slow accumulation of evidence that makes the story so devastating. Not one single act, but a series of calculated moves that painted a complete picture. And the emotional weight of this realization is immense. Trevor has described sleepless nights, moments of anger so intense he couldn't think straight, and periods of reflection where he questioned his own judgment. He asked himself over and over, did I miss the signs? Was I naive? Could I have seen this coming? It's a cycle familiar to anyone who's ever felt betrayed by someone they trusted completely. But in Trevor's case, it was magnified because of the public nature of the individuals involved, the documentation he had, and the life he thought they were building together. As the introduction of this story comes to its first major cliffhanger, consider the implications. Trevor Engelson, a man who believed he was in a loving marriage, suddenly found himself questioning everything. Every conversation, every shared moment, every promise. Could it have been part of a larger strategy? And with that realization, he knew that he had to take action, not just for himself, but to ensure that the truth, as he saw it, was recorded. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Every love story starts with a spark. Some are quiet, unassuming sparks that grow over years. Others are sudden, electric, impossible to ignore. For Trevor Engelson and Meghan Markle, it was the kind of meeting that felt like fate, or at least, that's what Trevor believed at the time. But what looked like destiny would later feel, to him, like a carefully constructed setup. How could a whirlwind romance, full of laughter and chemistry, mask the beginnings of what he would come to call betrayal? Trevor Engelson was already establishing himself in Hollywood as a talented producer. Known for his professionalism and eye for projects with potential, he had a career trajectory that promised stability and success. But beyond his professional life, he was a man seeking connection. Enter Meghan Markle. Charming, articulate, ambitious, and undeniably magnetic. Their paths crossed in a world built on appearances, networking, and serendipity, or so it seemed. Trevor recalls the initial meeting as enchanting, a collision of two people whose energies seemed to match perfectly. From the outside, it looked like a perfect Hollywood love story. But the shadows beneath that shine would later reveal an entirely different reality. Their courtship was swift. Emails, phone calls, dinners, and spontaneous outings. All were punctuated by the thrill of discovery. Trevor has said that the intensity of those first months felt almost cinematic. The two were often seen together at public events, mingling with friends and acquaintances, always presenting a picture of unity, charm, and compatibility. For Trevor, every smile, every touch, and every shared joke reinforced the belief that he had found a true partner. And yet, even in those early months, there were subtle inconsistencies. Perhaps Meghan would sidestep personal questions, or her responses would feel rehearsed, polished, or strategic. At the time, Trevor brushed these off. Who doesn't have quirks? Who doesn't have moments of guardedness in a new relationship? But hindsight, as he would later realize, paints those quirks in a much more suspicious light. The engagement came as a natural progression of their whirlwind romance. Friends described the announcement as a mix of surprise and inevitability. For Trevor, it was a moment of genuine joy. He was excited to build a life together, unaware of the undercurrents that might have been shaping Meghan's decisions. The engagement was celebrated privately, with close friends and family witnessing what appeared to be a deeply affectionate bond. Publicly, the engagement was even more polished. Smiling faces, coordinated outfits, and carefully curated announcements that projected happiness, stability, and love. The media coverage, though not as intense as Meghan's later years, still contributed to the perception that this was a couple destined for success together. As the months progressed, Trevor began to notice subtle patterns. Meghan, who seemed so connected and attentive at the start, occasionally pulled away. Late-night calls would be unanswered. Plans would change abruptly. Words and actions, once aligned, now began to feel slightly off. Trevor recalls moments of confusion, questioning whether he was reading too much into things. He tells of one particularly jarring instance where an intimate conversation suddenly veered into distant territory, leaving him emotionally adrift. These moments were few and far between at first, almost imperceptible, but over time, they accumulated, leaving a residue of doubt. Hollywood culture, of course, complicates relationships. The line between personal and public life is blurry, and the constant pressure to appear perfect can mask real emotions. Trevor found himself navigating this complex terrain, trying to understand whether Meghan's occasional aloofness was simply a product of ambition and career demands or a sign of something deeper. He had no idea, at the time, that these early signs were pieces of a larger puzzle that would only become visible years later. Then there was Meghan's career. She was pursuing acting roles, working on projects that required dedication, visibility, and networking. Trevor, supportive and enthusiastic, encouraged her endeavors, often attending events with her, sharing insights, and celebrating successes. But as he invested more emotionally and socially, small discrepancies became more noticeable. Conversations about the future sometimes felt evasive. Discussions about personal motivations occasionally seemed carefully crafted. Trevor had an intuitive sense, even then, that the energy in the relationship was not entirely mutual, or at least, not entirely transparent. Friends who observed the couple during this period offer mixed insights. Some describe a genuinely affectionate pair, laughing together, supporting each other's ambitions, and appearing inseparable. Others recall moments where Meghan seemed to prioritize appearance, influence, and opportunity over genuine intimacy. Trevor, immersed in the whirlwind of romance, initially discounted these observations. But in retrospect, he recognizes them as early indicators of a pattern that would later shock him. The engagement period was a time of both celebration and subtle unease. Trevor began to notice that certain topics, future planning, family discussions, personal reflections, elicited guarded responses. Meghan's charm was consistent, but at times, it felt strategic. Emails and messages, though friendly and loving, occasionally revealed an acute awareness of timing and optics. Trevor, unaware of the emerging pattern, often interpreted these nuances as normal behavior in a high-profile relationship. The stage was being set, but the play was invisible to him. And then came the wedding preparations. They were a perfect mix of elegance and Hollywood flair. Invitations, venues, and guest lists were meticulously arranged. Public appearances were carefully timed. Friends and family described the process as smooth and joyous. Yet beneath the surface, Trevor began to sense subtle inconsistencies. Conversations about long-term plans sometimes felt scripted. Decisions that should have been mutual occasionally seemed guided by an invisible hand. Trevor, caught up in the excitement of impending marriage, overlooked these cues. The glamour, the attention, and the anticipation all served to obscure the reality that would later emerge with such devastating clarity. What's crucial to understand about this early phase is the contrast between perception and reality. From the outside, Trevor and Meghan appeared ideal, a Hollywood couple in love, ambitious yet supportive, charismatic and well-matched. From the inside, however, Trevor was beginning to encounter the first whispers of doubt, tiny inconsistencies, evasions, and subtle emotional withdrawals. He didn't yet know it, but these early signs were the precursors to the revelations that would later define his understanding of the marriage. Perhaps the most revealing element of this beginning phase is the emotional investment Trevor placed in the relationship. He believed in the fairness of love, the authenticity of connection, and the shared vision of a future together. Each day, each moment, each intimate conversation reinforced that belief. And yet, it is exactly this emotional investment that made the eventual discovery so painful. Betrayal, after all, is most acute when trust has been fully given, when the heart has been laid bare, and when every hope for a shared life has been nurtured. Trevor's trust was complete, and the depth of that trust amplified the magnitude of the shock he would later experience. As we leave the beginning of the dream behind and move toward the next phase, the marriage that everyone envied, we are faced with the first major cliffhanger. Trevor Engelson, at this point, had no reason to suspect manipulation, no reason to anticipate betrayal. And yet, the subtle signs were already present, the patterns already emerging, and the path toward heartbreak already being paved. But what came next, the period after the wedding, the granting of the green card, and the subtle withdrawal of emotional connection, would change everything. And as Trevor would later reflect, once the pieces fell into place, he realized the truth. The love he believed he had found was not what it seemed. A wedding can feel like the culmination of a fairy tale. For Trevor Engelson and Meghan Markle, their marriage was everything the public expected: glamorous, polished, and seemingly filled with love. Friends, family, and colleagues looked on with admiration, marveling at the couple's apparent chemistry. The images were everywhere: smiles, elegant attire, perfectly staged photographs. And yet, behind the scenes, the reality was far more complex. What looked like a perfect union to outsiders was, according to Trevor, already beginning to show cracks that only time and hindsight could fully reveal. The wedding itself was a spectacle, blending Hollywood flair with personal touches that reflected the couple's style. Invitations were sent, venues decorated, and an aura of anticipation hung over every detail. Guests recall the event as joyous, filled with laughter and celebration. From the photographs alone, one could imagine a storybook romance reaching its climax. But Trevor, immersed in the whirlwind, began to notice moments that felt slightly off. A glance here, a subtle shift in tone there, small things, easily dismissed. At the time, he chalked them up to nerves, excitement, or the sheer stress of orchestrating such a significant life event. On the day itself, Meghan exuded confidence, charm, and poise. Trevor, proud and captivated, believed he was entering the next chapter of a life defined by love and partnership. Family and friends commented on the chemistry, how effortlessly they seemed to complement each other, and how their smiles lit up every room. Yet, even amidst this celebration, Trevor began to notice small inconsistencies. Conversations sometimes seemed rehearsed, and moments of intimate dialogue occasionally felt interrupted by a subtle awareness of how things might appear to others. These were the first signs of a recurring pattern. In hindsight, Trevor recognized that Meghan's public persona, the confident, radiant bride adored by everyone, often diverged from her private behavior. Behind the scenes, she was attentive, yes, but there were also moments of emotional withdrawal, subtle redirections, and careful management of interactions. Trevor didn't fully grasp it then, but these were the earliest indicators of a pattern that would later become central to his understanding of the marriage: the careful balancing of charm, optics, and strategy. The honeymoon period, often romanticized as the perfect time for newlyweds, was similarly complex. Public appearances, social events, and professional obligations continued to punctuate their lives, leaving little room for the kind of private intimacy that allows couples to fully connect. Trevor recounts moments of deep conversation that seemed to drift into uncharacteristic evasions. Questions about long-term plans were sometimes met with vague answers, small delays, or subtle deflections. At first, he didn't overthink it. Love, after all, can be messy, especially for high-profile couples navigating public and private spheres simultaneously. But the inconsistencies persisted, and over time, they began to build a subtle, almost imperceptible tension. Friends and insiders recall that Meghan was often the center of attention, naturally drawing the gaze of those around her. Trevor, supportive and attentive, encouraged her career pursuits and celebrated her successes. Yet, within that dynamic, he sometimes felt a quiet dissonance. What should have been shared victories occasionally felt like solo achievements. Emails and social messages, while polite and affectionate, sometimes revealed an acute awareness of timing, optics, and public perception. Trevor, unaware at the time of any deeper intent, attributed these behaviors to the natural pressures of career and social life. Throughout this period, Trevor also became increasingly aware of the subtle difference between public admiration and private connection. The world saw a couple in love, partners supporting each other's dreams, thriving in the spotlight. But in private, Trevor occasionally felt a sense of distance, as if the emotional depth of the relationship was not entirely reciprocated. It wasn't dramatic, not yet. It was the quiet, persistent sense that something wasn't fully aligned, that the energy in the relationship was slightly off balance. The juxtaposition of public celebration and private subtle tension is crucial to understanding this chapter of their story. Outsiders would never have guessed the undercurrents present, yet these small inconsistencies were the seeds of doubt that would later grow into clarity for Trevor. The wedding, in all its spectacle, did not obscure the emerging reality. The marriage, while seemingly perfect, carried within it the first signs of what he would later interpret as manipulation and calculated planning. As the weeks turned into months, Trevor observed patterns that reinforced this unease. Moments of closeness were often interrupted by subtle withdrawals. Conversations about the future sometimes felt carefully guided rather than spontaneous. Tasks and decisions that one might expect to be shared between partners were occasionally navigated in ways that suggested forethought, timing, and strategy. At the time, Trevor lacked the context to fully understand these behaviors. He saw them as minor inconsistencies, quirks of personality, or temporary lapses caused by stress and public life. But, in retrospect, these were early indicators of a calculated approach, small pieces of a puzzle that only later would reveal a much larger picture. Meanwhile, friends and family played a crucial role, often serving as observers, supporters, and confidants. They noted the outward appearance of happiness and love, occasionally raising subtle questions about private behaviors. Trevor, immersed in his own experience, sometimes missed these cues. And yet, those external perspectives, combined with his own growing awareness of inconsistencies, laid the groundwork for the eventual realization that something more complex was occurring behind the scenes. The emotional landscape of the marriage during this period is equally important. Trevor experienced genuine joy, pride, and excitement. He invested himself fully in the relationship, celebrating milestones, sharing successes, and envisioning a life built together. And yet, he also began to encounter moments of emotional ambiguity, subtle doubts that he could not quite articulate. These moments, while small individually, created an underlying tension, a feeling that the relationship, while outwardly perfect, was subtly different beneath the surface. As public life continued to dominate their days, the private moments became increasingly telling. Trevor recalls dinners, late-night conversations, and quiet walks where the emotional dissonance was palpable. He noticed small changes in tone, timing, and responsiveness. Questions about the future, once easy to navigate, became fraught with careful phrasing and measured responses. It was in these private interactions that Trevor first began to sense that the dynamics of the relationship were more complex than he had realized. By the end of this period, Trevor Engelson had reached a critical juncture. The marriage was underway, celebrated by friends and family, admired by the public, yet underpinned by subtle inconsistencies and emotional gaps. He could feel, if not fully articulate, that something was amiss. The small, almost imperceptible signs that had appeared early in the courtship were now more frequent, more noticeable, and more difficult to dismiss. He had no reason, at this point, to suspect calculated manipulation, but the pattern was beginning to emerge, a pattern that would later become undeniable. And so we arrive at the cliffhanger that closes this chapter. The marriage, celebrated and admired by everyone who witnessed it, carried within it the first true indicators of the revelation to come. Trevor Engelson, at this point, still believed in love, still trusted in partnership, and still invested fully in the relationship. But what he did not know, and what the next chapters will reveal, is that the very foundation of the marriage, the trust and intimacy he believed in, might not have been entirely authentic. Small inconsistencies, subtle withdrawals, and carefully guided interactions were only the beginning of a story that would soon unfold in ways no one expected. But what came next, the slow, deliberate withdrawal of emotional connection, the timing of the green card, the subtle manipulations behind private communications, would completely change Trevor's perception of everything he had built with Meghan Markle. And as the pieces fell into place, he would finally see a pattern so deliberate, so calculated, that it left him questioning not only their marriage, but the very motives behind every smile, every gesture, every promise. Then the timeline didn't add up. At first, Trevor Engelson didn't notice anything unusual. In the midst of wedding planning, career demands, and the excitement of newlywed life, the bureaucratic details of Meghan Markle's immigration process seemed routine, almost mundane. A green card, after all, is just paperwork, right? But as the months went by, small details began to emerge: dates, conversations, lawyer correspondence, that didn't align with what Trevor had understood. Little inconsistencies in timing, subtle shifts in tone during discussions, and the meticulous way certain documents were handled began to gnaw at him. What initially seemed like normal administrative process slowly took on a more calculated, almost purposeful shape. To understand the gravity of this, it helps to know exactly what a green card represents. For anyone immigrating to the United States, it is more than a piece of paper. It is legal residency, the freedom to live and work, the foundation upon which an entire life can be built. It is also, inherently, a process that requires transparency, honesty, and documentation. Trevor, invested emotionally and socially in his marriage, trusted that everything would unfold naturally. He assumed that, like any couple, he and Meghan were navigating the necessary steps together, that her obtaining permanent residency was part of the shared plan for their future. But as the emails and lawyer documents began to surface later, a different picture emerged, one in which the timeline, the strategic communication, and the emotional distance were far too precise to be coincidental. At first, Trevor rationalized the oddities. Perhaps the delays were normal. Perhaps Meghan's distant moments were due to stress or distraction. Perhaps he was overthinking minor details that had no real significance. He trusted her, after all, and assumed that love, honesty, and partnership were guiding forces. But the subtle discrepancies in dates, document submissions, and communications started forming patterns that were impossible to ignore. The realization began slowly, creeping into his consciousness piece by piece, until it became undeniable that something wasn't right. Emails, which later became a crucial part of the narrative, started to make sense in a way they hadn't before. Certain messages were carefully timed, phrased, and sent in ways that suggested a meticulous awareness of legal and procedural deadlines. Lawyer documents, initially appearing routine, revealed attention to precise intervals, signaling an acute awareness of immigration requirements. When these documents were later pieced together with private communications, a pattern emerged. Meghan Markle, according to Trevor, had a clear understanding of the green card process and, more importantly, appeared to orchestrate interactions and communications in a way that strategically aligned with its approval. Trevor began to look back at moments that had seemed inconsequential at the time. A casual conversation about paperwork suddenly took on a different tone. A brief avoidance of discussion about travel plans became more meaningful. Small delays in communication that had been dismissed now hinted at calculated timing. Trevor's mind raced with questions. Was this manipulation? Was it strategic? Could it all have been coincidental? The deeper he dug, the more the dots seemed to connect in ways that were impossible to ignore. The timeline itself is critical. Within months of marriage, Meghan's green card process moved forward, seemingly without issue. The speed of approval, coupled with her carefully managed communications, left Trevor both relieved and puzzled. Relieved because the bureaucratic process was completed successfully, but puzzled because the precision and timing of events began to suggest forethought that went beyond ordinary planning. By this point, Trevor had begun to sense that something was amiss, even if he could not yet fully articulate what. It was during this period that the emotional dissonance became more pronounced. Trevor, invested in both his career and his marriage, noticed Meghan beginning to create subtle distance. The intensity and immediacy of attention that had characterized the courtship period began to fade. Conversations that once seemed natural now required effort. Late-night discussions about the future became increasingly rare. Emotional warmth, which had been a hallmark of the early relationship, was now punctuated with pauses, delayed responses, and subtle shifts in tone. Trevor describes these moments with a mixture of confusion and heartbreak. At the time, he did not interpret them as deliberate actions. He simply felt the absence of connection, the growing gap between expectation and reality. But in hindsight, when paired with the meticulous timing of the green card process, these behaviors began to appear deliberate, part of a larger pattern that he had been too emotionally invested to notice initially. As the approval came through, the reality of the situation began to crystallize. Meghan now had the legal freedom and security to live and work in the United States permanently. For any ordinary couple, travel schedules, phone calls, and private conversations, which might have seemed unremarkable at the time, later revealed a pattern of precision and calculated timing. Trevor began to revisit every interaction with fresh eyes, asking himself whether he had missed obvious signs. The slow accumulation of evidence created a growing awareness that the marriage may have been less about mutual love and more about achieving a personal objective. And so the cliffhanger emerges at the close of this chapter. Trevor Engelson, now starting to see the connections, was faced with a dawning realization. The emotional warmth, the shared laughter, the intimate moments. They were all occurring in parallel with a precise, calculated timeline that aligned perfectly with Meghan's legal milestones. The very foundation of their marriage, built on trust and shared life goals, was beginning to appear, to him, as strategically structured for someone else's gain. But what Trevor would discover next, the emotional withdrawal, the subtle ghosting, and the discrepancies in communication, would finally confirm the fears that had begun to surface. The timeline was not just a bureaucratic artifact. It was a roadmap, and Trevor was only beginning to understand the destination it led to. And what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. She was there one moment, and gone the next. Not physically gone. Trevor Engelson still saw Meghan Markle at dinners, events, and family gatherings. But emotionally, the connection began to fray in ways he couldn't yet articulate. The early signs of ghosting were subtle, almost imperceptible, but Trevor, sensitive to the nuances of their interactions, began to notice patterns that left him unsettled. Texts went unanswered for longer than usual. Calls that had once been immediate and warm were now delayed or deflected. Conversations that should have been intimate and meaningful sometimes ended abruptly, leaving a void that was difficult to ignore. At first, he rationalized it. Perhaps she was busy. Perhaps she was distracted by work. Perhaps it was just a phase in a high-profile relationship. But as these moments accumulated, a pattern emerged. It wasn't random. It had rhythm, timing, and consistency. The warmth that had characterized their early courtship seemed to be gradually replaced by distance, and the dissonance between public appearances and private interactions grew sharper. Trevor often recalls the feeling of confusion and emotional whiplash. One day, Meghan could be attentive, charming, and loving, reinforcing his belief that everything was normal. The next, she would be distant, preoccupied, or emotionally unavailable, leaving him questioning his own perceptions. It was a cycle that left him exhausted, frustrated, and increasingly aware that something was not right. The pattern of early ghosting was subtle enough that it could be dismissed, yet persistent enough to plant seeds of doubt. Emails and text messages from this period, later made public by Trevor, highlight the subtlety of this emotional distancing. Responses were sometimes delayed hours, even days. Messages that once included thoughtful reflections or affectionate language now contained neutral phrasing, brief acknowledgments, or questions that seemed designed to redirect the conversation. Trevor, at the time, tried to interpret these changes generously, believing that she was simply busy or distracted. But in hindsight, these communications were part of a larger, emerging pattern of emotional withdrawal. The timing of these withdrawals is particularly significant. They often coincided with critical moments in the green card process, as though the focus on legal milestones was prioritized over emotional connection. Trevor, immersed in both his own career and the relationship, initially failed to recognize the correlation. But the recurring alignment of emotional distance with procedural progress would later reinforce his perception of calculated behavior. It wasn't just digital communication that changed. Private conversations, in-person interactions, and shared plans began to feel strained. Trevor noticed subtle shifts in tone, body language, and engagement. Meghan, who had previously been fully present, sometimes seemed distracted, preoccupied, or even rehearsed in her responses. Moments of vulnerability, once freely shared, became rarer. The dynamic shifted from mutual intimacy to one-sided engagement, leaving Trevor feeling increasingly isolated despite their proximity. Friends and family observed these changes too. While outwardly the couple appeared harmonious and affectionate at public events, those close to them noticed the subtle disconnect. Trevor often discussed his feelings with confidence, though he struggled to articulate the depth of his unease. The discrepancy between public perception and private reality created a tension that was emotionally exhausting. It's a common phenomenon in relationships, particularly those under public scrutiny, but in Trevor's case, it was magnified by the earlier revelations about timelines and green card processing. The psychological impact of early ghosting is profound. For Trevor, it introduced doubt, anxiety, and a growing need to reconcile appearances with reality. He began to question whether he was overreacting, whether he misinterpreted signals, or whether he was simply too sensitive. But the recurring patterns, the precise timing, and the consistency of the withdrawal began to erode his trust. The cognitive dissonance between believing in love and recognizing emotional distance created a state of tension that would only intensify as the months progressed. What made this phase particularly painful was the juxtaposition of public and private personas. In public, Meghan was charming, engaged, and socially graceful. She presented herself as a loving partner, attentive and charismatic. Privately, however, the emotional presence that Trevor relied on was inconsistent at best. This duality created a sense of instability, leaving him unsure how to interpret her actions. Was she simply busy or ambitious, or was there something more strategic behind the behavior? Trevor's reflections on this period reveal the slow accumulation of awareness. The early signs of ghosting were subtle enough to be dismissible, yet consistent enough to create discomfort. He began cataloging moments in his mind, connecting delayed responses with emotional withdrawal, and noticing patterns in timing and context. Conversations about the future, discussions about shared plans, and even casual interactions began to reveal a level of detachment that had not existed before. The emotional toll was significant. Trevor describes feelings of confusion, frustration, and subtle betrayal. The pattern of engagement and withdrawal left him constantly questioning his own judgment. He recalls nights lying awake, replaying conversations, and attempting to decipher whether the emotional distance was temporary, circumstantial, or indicative of a deeper issue. It was during these moments of reflection that the seeds of suspicion regarding manipulation and calculated behavior began to take root. Friends' perspectives further illuminate the tension of this period. Some noted that Meghan seemed increasingly focused on personal advancement, career opportunities, and public visibility, sometimes at the expense of private intimacy. Trevor, invested emotionally and socially, initially interpreted these behaviors as ambition and drive rather than signs of strategic distancing. Yet, the alignment of these behaviors with other emerging patterns, particularly surrounding the green card timeline, began to suggest a more deliberate orchestration. The subtlety of early ghosting lies in its invisibility. It doesn't announce itself with dramatic actions or confrontations. Instead, it creeps in through delayed responses, minor disengagement, and inconsistent attentiveness. Trevor, caught between love and suspicion, experienced this creep as a form of psychological whiplash. One day, he felt connected and secure. The next, he questioned the authenticity of their relationship. This emotional oscillation is a hallmark of early withdrawal, and it sets the stage for deeper realizations that would come later. By the end of this period, Trevor began to sense that the emotional dynamics were shifting in a way that could not be ignored. The early signs of ghosting, subtle, consistent, and carefully timed, had introduced doubt and suspicion into his perception of the marriage. While he still believed in love and partnership, he could no longer dismiss the accumulating evidence of distance and detachment. The relationship, once seemingly straightforward, now carried layers of ambiguity and tension that demanded closer scrutiny. And so the cliffhanger emerges. Trevor Engelson, now attuned to the patterns of withdrawal and early ghosting, faced a growing question he never imagined he would ask. Was this emotional distance circumstantial, or was it intentional? Had the very person he trusted most been manipulating the rhythm of their connection all along? The answers would not come immediately, but the foundation for revelation had been laid, and what came next would confirm fears, expose motives, and forever alter Trevor's understanding of his marriage. Then the evidence appeared, not as a sudden revelation, but as a slow unraveling of truths hidden in plain sight. Trevor Engelson began revisiting emails, lawyer notes, and private correspondence from the earliest days of their marriage, each piece of information layering over the last, forming a narrative that was impossible to ignore. At first, he didn't want to believe it. He had already begun noticing inconsistencies, subtle emotional withdrawal, and signs of early ghosting. But seeing concrete documents, timestamps, and communications laid out before him made the truth unavoidable. The emails were deceptively ordinary on the surface. Conversations about mundane things, scheduling, logistics, or work-related questions. But when examined in sequence, patterns emerged, precise timing that aligned with critical milestones in Meghan's green card process, careful phrasing designed to redirect or control dialogue, and subtle shifts in tone that suggested strategic intent. Every delayed response, every neutral phrasing, every calculated reassurance began to paint a picture that seemed almost engineered. Trevor, initially incredulous, began to realize that the quirks he had dismissed during the early months of the marriage were actually part of a meticulously designed pattern. The lawyer documents reinforced these patterns. Legal communications that might have seemed routine at first glance, filings, approvals, notices, contained clues that, in hindsight, indicated precise awareness of timelines and requirements. Certain steps were expedited, carefully coordinated, or phrased in ways that suggested an underlying strategy. Trevor couldn't ignore the alignment between these documents and the emotional distance he had been experiencing. Each piece of evidence added a layer of clarity and a layer of heartbreak. It's important to understand the psychological impact of discovering such documents. Trevor had trusted Meghan completely. He had invested emotionally, socially, and personally. To realize that there might have been an ulterior motive behind so many decisions, so many interactions, is profoundly destabilizing. Emails that had once seemed affectionate or neutral now appeared strategic. Conversations that had felt intimate were now tinged with manipulation. Documents that had seemed mundane now revealed a calculated orchestration of events. The emotional weight of this discovery cannot be overstated. Friends and confidants who observed this period recall Trevor's growing agitation. He began cross-referencing dates, rereading messages, and attempting to reconcile the warmth of the early relationship with the patterns emerging from these communications. The dissonance between memory and documentation created a gnawing tension. What he once considered minor anomalies were now part of a coherent and deeply unsettling narrative. One email, in particular, stood out. Sent early in their marriage, it seemed innocuous at first, a casual message about coordinating schedules. But when juxtaposed with subsequent communications and legal filings, it revealed an acute awareness of timing, phrasing, and procedural strategy. Trevor described reading it as a chilling moment. The realization that actions he had once interpreted as spontaneous or affectionate were, in fact, deliberately aligned with legal and procedural milestones. The revelation cut deep, intertwining betrayal, confusion, and disbelief. The lawyer documents offered additional insight. Notes from attorneys, drafts of filings, and correspondence between legal professionals revealed that certain steps had been timed with precision. Approvals came just after key interactions, submissions were aligned with carefully calculated intervals, and communications reflected an acute awareness of potential scrutiny. Trevor began to perceive the process not as a routine legal procedure, but as a carefully orchestrated sequence in which he had been an unwitting participant. As he pieced these elements together, Trevor's perception of the marriage began to shift dramatically. The early signs of ghosting, emotional withdrawal, and subtle inconsistencies in behavior were no longer isolated events. Instead, they fit into a larger narrative. One in which the emotional, logistical, and legal elements of the relationship were intertwined in ways that suggested deliberate orchestration. It was a perspective that was both horrifying and enlightening. Horrifying because of the betrayal it implied, enlightening because it provided a framework for understanding months of confusion, doubt, and emotional turmoil. The pattern extended beyond dates and documents to include tone, phrasing, and subtle cues. Neutral or perfunctory responses in emails were often timed to correspond with significant milestones. Delayed replies sometimes coincided with critical steps in the green card process. Conversations that seemed trivial or mundane at the time now appeared to serve a strategic purpose, shaping perception, controlling narrative, and guiding emotional engagement. Trevor began to understand that the marriage he believed in, the partnership, trust, and shared vision, had been interacting with a parallel narrative he had not initially recognized. Emotionally, this period was intense. Trevor described a mixture of shock, grief, and anger. Every document, every email, and every note forced him to reconsider the past, the laughter, the intimacy, the perceived trust. How much had been genuine? How much had been guided by strategy and careful planning? The process of reconciliation was not just legal or logistical. It was deeply personal, requiring him to confront the dissonance between memory and evidence. Friends and confidants watched as Trevor oscillated between disbelief and clarity. At times, he questioned his own interpretation, fearing that emotional turbulence might be coloring his perception. At other times, the alignment of documents, emails, and observed behaviors left little room for doubt. The consistency, timing, and precision of the evidence created a narrative that, according to Trevor, could not be dismissed as coincidence. The cliffhanger that closes this chapter is the realization itself. Trevor Engelson, armed with emails, lawyer documents, and private correspondence, began to see a picture of the marriage he had never imagined. The warmth of love, the intimacy of connection, the sense of partnership, all were now juxtaposed against a pattern that suggested strategic orchestration. And while he had not yet confronted Meghan directly about these revelations, the emotional groundwork was laid for the confrontation that would change everything. But what came next? The confrontation, the questions, and the undeniable acknowledgement of his suspicions would finally force Trevor to face the reality of his marriage. And what he discovered in that confrontation would shock him to his core, and the world would eventually hear his story. He asked her directly. The moment was tense, charged with an intensity that only builds when trust has been tested and questions hang in the air like storm clouds. Trevor Engelson, who had spent months grappling with subtle signs, inconsistencies, and the mounting evidence from emails and legal documents, finally reached the point where he could no longer ignore the gnawing suspicion that had been haunting him. The confrontation wasn't just about facts, it was about truth, betrayal, and the very foundation of their relationship. The conversation began cautiously. Trevor recalls carefully choosing his words, balancing the need for clarity with the fear of provoking defensiveness. He asked questions about their early months, about communications, about the timing of milestones in the green card process. At first, Meghan's responses were measured, composed, and seemingly harmless. But Trevor, attuned by months of observation and reflection, could feel the tension beneath the surface. There was a subtle shift in energy, a controlled tone that spoke volumes to someone familiar with the nuances of her behavior. As the dialogue unfolded, Trevor noticed patterns that mirrored the ones he had identified in documents and emails. Evasive answers, slight deflections, and calculated phrasing all pointed toward a deliberate orchestration of narrative. He had suspected manipulation, but hearing it, or rather, sensing it in real time, was a different kind of revelation. It was emotional, visceral, and deeply disorienting. He felt simultaneously enlightened and heartbroken, seeing months of affection, shared moments, and intimate conversations in a new, unsettling light. The confrontation escalated as Trevor pressed for honesty. He asked pointed questions about the nature of their marriage, about the green card process, and about her intentions. Each answer, while superficially polite and measured, carried subtle cues that confirmed his suspicions. There was no dramatic confession, no loud declaration of deceit. Instead, it was in the gaps, the timing, and the careful wording that the truth revealed itself. The realization hit him slowly but powerfully. The foundation of his marriage may have been structured around objectives that were not shared equally. Emotionally, this period was intense. Trevor describes feelings of betrayal, shock, and grief interwoven with moments of anger and disbelief. The cognitive dissonance was profound. The woman he loved, who had been his partner and confidant, may have treated the relationship as a strategic tool rather than a mutual commitment. He wrestled with memories of intimacy, laughter, and shared plans, trying to reconcile them with the emerging narrative suggested by his evidence. Each recollection became a double-edged sword, simultaneously comforting and painful. Friends and confidants who observed Trevor during this period noted a profound transformation. The man who had once approached the marriage with trust and optimism now carried a burden of suspicion and analytical rigor. He spent hours reviewing emails, cross-referencing dates, and attempting to reconstruct the chronology of events. Every message, every document, and every interaction was scrutinized for hidden meaning, patterns, and alignment with milestones in the green card process. This meticulous review process was not only emotionally taxing, but also necessary for Trevor to understand the full scope of what he perceived as betrayal. The confrontation also revealed the subtle complexity of Meghan's behavior. She was strategic, aware, and precise in her interactions. Responses were carefully phrased, sometimes deflecting, sometimes redirecting, and occasionally offering reassurance without true engagement. Trevor, who had invested deeply in the emotional bond, recognized these behaviors as consistent with the patterns he had been documenting. The insight was painful. What he had interpreted as occasional emotional distance was part of a recurring dynamic that aligned with legal, procedural, and strategic milestones. This phase of realization was not instantaneous. It unfolded gradually. Trevor recounts moments of sudden clarity, followed by periods of reflection, analysis, and emotional processing. He experienced a roller coaster of emotions: grief over lost trust, anger at perceived manipulation, disbelief that such behavior could occur within a marriage, and, ultimately, the slow crystallization of understanding. The interplay of these feelings created a complex emotional landscape, one that required both introspection and outward examination of evidence. The gravity of this confrontation cannot be overstated. Trevor had invested years of emotional energy, career support, and personal trust into a relationship that now appeared to have been leveraged for personal objectives he had not initially recognized. The revelation forced him to question not only past interactions, but also the authenticity of every shared moment, every intimate conversation, and every promise made during the early phases of the marriage. The emotional toll was immense, blending heartbreak, shock, and a sense of betrayal that extended beyond the personal into the professional and social realms. In hindsight, Trevor identifies specific turning points in this confrontation that solidified his understanding. Subtle admissions, carefully worded clarifications, and moments of unintentional candor all contributed to a growing awareness that his suspicions were not unfounded. Each revelation, while incremental, built toward a cohesive narrative, a pattern of strategic orchestration, emotional withdrawal, and calculated behavior that aligned precisely with milestones in the green card process and other life events. Friends and family offered support, though they too struggled to reconcile the outwardly charming and accomplished Meghan Markle with the behaviors Trevor was observing. Discussions often revolved around nuance, perception, and the difficulty of discerning intent in high-profile relationships. Trevor's meticulous attention to emails, documents, and private communications became a form of verification, a way to anchor his understanding in tangible evidence rather than solely emotional interpretation. The emotional intensity of the confrontation reached its peak when Trevor realized the extent to which the green card process, combined with subtle withdrawal and strategic engagement, had influenced the dynamics of their marriage. He saw the connection between carefully timed communications, deliberate emotional distancing, and procedural milestones as undeniable. The sense of betrayal was magnified not only by the perceived manipulation, but also by the realization that he had been emotionally invested in a relationship whose underlying motives were misaligned with his own. And so the cliffhanger emerges. Trevor Engelson, having confronted Meghan directly and having processed months of subtle cues, evidence, and emotional inconsistencies, arrived at a stark conclusion. The woman he loved, who had shared laughter, intimacy, and partnership, may have engaged in a carefully orchestrated strategy that prioritized personal objectives over shared emotional commitment. He faced a profound choice: continue navigating the relationship in uncertainty or take decisive action in response to what he now perceived as betrayal. But what came next, the public acknowledgement, the emotional fallout, and the steps toward divorce, would solidify his understanding of the full extent of the manipulation he believed had occurred. And what happened during that next phase would shock everyone who thought they knew the story, and forever alter the narrative of Trevor Engelson's marriage to Meghan Markle. The world saw one Meghan Markle, and Trevor Engelson saw another. From the outside, Meghan was radiant, poised, and effortlessly charming, a woman who seemed destined for fame, admiration, and success. Cameras loved her, audiences adored her, and the press painted her as a rising star with grace, intelligence, and charisma. Public appearances were flawless, perfectly timed smiles, carefully chosen words, and the kind of presence that commands attention without seeming to try. Trevor, who had been deeply in love, often found himself marveling at her magnetism. But what he saw behind closed doors was an entirely different reality, one filled with subtle distance, calculated behaviors, and moments that felt orchestrated rather than spontaneous. The contrast between public and private personas became impossible to ignore as time went on. In public, Meghan could charm anyone, making friends, acquaintances, and even strangers feel seen and appreciated. Trevor, proud and supportive, often accompanied her to events, witnessing firsthand the warmth and charisma she projected. The admiration she received was well-earned. She had a presence that captivated people. Yet, the very behaviors that made her compelling in public often contrasted sharply with her private interactions. At home, the Meghan Trevor knew sometimes seemed distant, measured, and emotionally detached. Conversations that had once been fluid now carried subtle hesitations. Messages were punctuated with pauses, neutral phrasing, or carefully placed words that redirected attention. Emotional availability fluctuated in ways that were inconsistent with the warmth and openness observed in public. Trevor began to notice that the charm he had initially fallen for in private moments was sometimes reserved for appearances, rather than being consistent across all facets of their life together. This duality created tension, confusion, and emotional strain. Trevor often questioned whether he was overanalyzing, projecting concerns, or misinterpreting behaviors. But repeated patterns, combined with earlier revelations from emails and legal documents, began to suggest that these discrepancies were not coincidental. The public persona of Meghan, the poised, charming, and engaging figure, was meticulously maintained, while private interactions displayed emotional gaps, subtle withdrawal, and careful timing that aligned with key milestones in their marriage. Friends and family observed this duality as well. Outwardly, the couple seemed perfect, affectionate, well-matched, and socially graceful. Privately, however, close confidants noticed the subtle disengagement that Trevor experienced firsthand. Conversations that appeared casual were sometimes laced with redirection. Questions about feelings or future plans were occasionally deflected. Emotional warmth, while present at times, was inconsistent. Trevor began to realize that these patterns, when combined with the green card timeline and early ghosting, formed a larger, coherent narrative that had gone unnoticed by outsiders. The psychology behind public versus private personas is complex. For Meghan, maintaining a charming, flawless public image was beneficial professionally, socially, and strategically. For Trevor, the disconnect between this polished exterior and the nuanced private interactions was confusing and emotionally draining. He found himself constantly reconciling the warmth, charm, and attentiveness she displayed in public with the subtle distance, careful phrasing, and strategic withdrawal in private.